you. Thank you, Subha, for having me here and being willing to bluff your way through the introduction. I would like to just take you up on your whole thing of ambition, and all centers that come up have to be set up with a degree of ambition. But I just like to define the ambition a little differently, in the sense that if we could help reduce the deficit, the knowledge deficits that help create the conflict that we see. I think Dr. Manoharan has brought out the extent to which conflict has increased. But there is a basic fundamental knowledge deficit that underlies it, and that is that our work on peace begins only after a conflict has emerged. We recognize a conflict, we see it as a conflict, and then believe that we should try to find some way of doing without it. Whereas, as with everything else, the idea of peace works best when you prevent a conflict from emerging itself. In order to recognize why peace could be shattered, why we need to have a simple but I think useful understanding of conflict. And that is to see conflict as a combination of two things. One is a divergence of interest, and then the incompatible actions that follow based on that divergence of interest. When you see it in these two terms, there's a need to track divergence of interest. Because when the world is changing, when countries are changing, there will necessarily be a divergence of interest. If you look at the inequalities in India over the centuries, it is inevitable and necessary and very positive that those inequalities change. People have argued at times that the conflict that goes with that change is inevitable, and some would say even desirable. I'm not so sure we should go that far, but we certainly must recognize that as change takes place, the relationships between individuals take place, you get a change in the relationship between groups, and unless you have a mechanism of managing that or a mechanism of addressing that, you're going to have substantial numbers of incompatible actions. The traditional kind of quick fixes that we have developed almost instinctively to this doesn't always work. The idea that we begin with a justification for a conflict, and based on the justification, we try to evolve a solution. The classic example is that we say that inequality and the poor pushes the poor to a point where they are forced into conflict. And then your solution corresponding to that justification is that we must improve development, remove poverty, and conflict would disappear. But any empirical analysis of India or the South Asia will tell you that the greater the growth, the greater the scope for conflict. The worst riots in India have occurred in our metropolitan centers, not in the most backward areas. The greatest loss of lives, when we have thousands of people dead, they're all happening in our metropolitan centers, or most of them are happening in metropolitan centers. You always find that, or even if you take the process of the state investing heavily in development, the resources get diverted and they go into people, to one or the other groups, which intends to enhance conflict. So we need to recognize how these processes work. We need to understand the mechanisms of these processes. And we need peace research that will help us recognize this, recognize the scope for peace, recognize the necessity of peace before conflict occurs. This is not simply a matter of saying there will be no divergence of interest. There will be divergence of interest. But it's also a matter of recognizing that incompatible actions, when they gather a momentum of their own, can in fact overwhelm divergence of interest. In fact, if you take India and Pakistan in say an organization like the WTO, your interests are almost identical, right from textiles to any number of things. Your interests are almost identical. So you have to take a common position, but the incompatibility, the sort of institutionalized incompatibility that has occurred over decades prevents us from doing so openly. Nevertheless, fortunately for both countries, a great deal of cooperation takes place. It's done by stealth, because you cannot afford to say that you're working with Pakistan in an international body, but a great deal of work does occur. So what I would think is that if you have a center which can really look at this, maybe its ambitions are great in the sense that it can actually stop a single conflict. That itself, if you look at the lives involved, would be a very, very substantial and very great ambition. And but in order to do that, you need a wider idea of peace. You need an idea of peace that recognizes the potential for conflict before it occurs. It recognizes the divergences take place. It recognizes the inevitability of divergence of interest at a time of vast change. The most stable societies are those that don't have change at all. The peace that we need is the peace that comes with change. It's not the peace of the graveyard. And I think that's something that this is a feature that I'm sure this initiative will take forward, and I look forward to helping out or being a part of it in any way possible. Thank you.